Help me, anything you have.
On a cold November evening, a man in a custom-tailored suit stepped out of a
Mom,
black
what are you
Mercedes
doing
in
here?
downtown San Francisco. He had just closed a $200 million deal. He was on
Mom,
top of the world.
what are you doing
And
here?
then he turned the corner and saw
Help
something
me,
that made him
anything
stop
you
walking.
have.
Standing outside a shelter with a cardboard sign, wearing a jacket he recognized from 15 years ago, was the woman who had sacrificed everything so he could have nothing. His mother, the one he had forgotten. Before we get into this story, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know if you're watching from the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom. We read every single comment and we'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear will change how you see family, loyalty, and what happens when success makes you forget where you came from. Now let's get into this. James Peterson had built everything. Not inherited. Built. $240 million. Real estate. Technology. Venture capital. 3 houses. 2 jets. A reputation as the kind of businessman who didn't just take meetings. He changed industries. He had everything a person could want. And he had almost completely forgotten where it came from. His mother, Eleanor Peterson, had raised him alone in San Francisco after his father left when James was 3 years old. She worked 3 jobs. Days cleaning houses in the wealthy neighborhoods of Pacific Heights and Presidio Heights. Nights at the hospital as a data entry clerk, entering patient records, processing insurance forms, doing the invisible work that kept the system running. Weekends doing bookkeeping from a laptop in their tiny apartment in the Richmond district. An apartment so small that when James grew tall enough, his bed took up most of the bedroom and Eleanor slept on the living room couch. She did this for 18 years. No vacations, no breaks, no days off, just singular focus. Getting James through school and into a better life. Eleanor was the kind of mother who made sacrifices without ever mentioning them. When James wanted to join the school chess team, she found the money somehow. When he needed textbooks that the school didn't provide, she worked an extra shift. When he got accepted to Stanford, she cried not because she was proud, but because she understood that her work had meant something. That all those nights cleaning other people's houses had been for this. For him, she succeeded. Stanford on a full scholarship. Degree in business and finance with honors. First company at 24. Wealthy by 30. Very wealthy by 35. By 38. The kind of wealthy where people stopped asking how much money he had because the question felt absurd. Eleanor became someone he called on her birthday. Sometimes on his birthday. 5-minute conversations. How are you, Mom? Good. How are you? Work is going well. That's nice. Okay, I have to go. Love you. Love you too. And then the phone would go silent for another 3 months. Nothing to say to each other anymore. Or that's what James told himself. The truth was more complicated. He had built a life so far from where he came from that going back felt like going backward. Every time he visited the old neighborhood, he felt like he was suffocating. The small streets, the modest houses, the people who still worked jobs like his mother's. He didn't want to be reminded of what he had escaped. He didn't want to feel guilty for being successful. So he stopped going. He stopped calling. He stopped answering when Eleanor reached out. When James was 35, he married a woman named Catherine Whitmore. Catherine came from old money. Not new money. Not earned money. Old money. The kind that had been sitting in trusts and investment accounts for generations. The kind of money that required you to use the right fork at dinner and say the right things at the right functions and wear the right clothes without ever thinking about cost. Catherine had never worked a day in her life. Catherine had never needed to. Her family owned half of Palo Alto. Her mother was on the boards of museums and universities. Her father was a venture capitalist who invested other people's money and took a percentage. When James met her at a charity gala, she was exactly the kind of woman his success had been supposed to attract. Educated, connected, beautiful in that understated way that only comes from never having had to try. She wore jewelry that cost more than his mother's car. She spoke about things with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never being told no. She was the logical next step in his ascension. He married her 11 months later. Eleanor wasn't invited to the wedding planning. She wasn't asked her opinion on the flowers or the venue or the guest list. She found out about the engagement from a Facebook post that James didn't even write. Catherine's mother had posted a photo of the ring with a caption about how thrilled the family was. Eleanor saw it along with 300 other people. She found out about the wedding date from an email. Not a personal email. A forwarded email from the wedding coordinator sent to the entire guest list. A guest list of 200 people. Eleanor's name was at the bottom in small font. She showed up to the ceremony in a dress she had saved for 6 years. A dress she had bought on sale at Macy's for $120. A dress she had taken to a tailor to have altered perfectly. She showed up wearing the only nice thing she owned besides her work clothes and her everyday clothes. She sat in the back row of a church with 200 people, watching her son marry a woman she had never met before that day. She sat there and clapped when they were told to clap. She sat there and cried a little when her son said his vows. She sat there and felt the strange contradiction of being proud of him and devastated by him all at once. Catherine took one look at Eleanor during the reception and made a decision that would echo through everything that came after. She decided that Eleanor was not the kind of mother-in-law who fit into the life James had built. Eleanor was a reminder of where James came from. She was a reminder that James had been raised in poverty, that James had worked his way up, that James was not born into this world. And Catherine had not married James to be reminded of anything. She had married him to secure the future she had already decided she deserved. The subtle campaign started immediately, so subtle that James didn't even notice it was happening until it was too late to stop it. Small things. At Christmas dinner, Catherine made a comment about Eleanor's homemade dessert being sweet, but not quite restaurant quality. She said it with a smile. She said it as a joke. She said it in front of 12 people. Eleanor laughed along with everyone else, because that's what you do when you're the person being insulted and no one else seems to notice. At Easter, when Eleanor brought her famous potato salad that James had grown up eating, the salad that he had requested specifically, Catherine mentioned how she had discovered authentic home cooking at a new restaurant downtown, and it was so much better than whatever this was. She gestured at the salad like it was something unpleasant. James didn't defend his mother. He tried the restaurant's potato salad. It was fine. It wasn't better. But he didn't say that. At a family dinner, when Eleanor mentioned the scholarship program she had started with her own money to help single mothers pay for their children's education, Catherine smiled and said, "That's nice, Eleanor. It's wonderful how some people find purpose in small things." The implication was clear. Catherine's purpose was not small. Catherine's purpose was large and important and worth discussing. Eleanor's purpose was quaint. It was something people did when they didn't have anything better to do. James heard these comments. He knew what they meant, but he said nothing, because the truth was that Catherine was right in a way that he couldn't admit even to himself. Eleanor didn't fit into the life he had built, and somewhere along the way, fitting in had become more important than loyalty, more important than gratitude, more important than love. 3 years into the marriage, Eleanor called James. She needed help. She had never asked him for money before. Never. In 38 years of his life, she had never asked. But now she was asking. The bookkeeping business had dried up. People were using accounting software now. They didn't need bookkeepers anymore. Eleanor was 62 years old. Social Security wasn't enough. She had saved everything she could for 40 years. But medical bills had eaten through most of it. She had had a hysterectomy, then her gallbladder. Then she needed dental work. Medical debt in America was like a tide. It just kept coming, and there was nowhere to hide. She was falling behind on rent. The landlord was nice about it, but he couldn't be nice forever. She had maybe 3 months before she would be evicted. She was asking if James could help, if he could lend her some money just to get through this difficult period. She would pay him back. She had always paid back her debts. James told her he would help. He meant it. He felt that familiar emotion rising in his chest. The guilt, the responsibility. The weight of knowing that he owed his life to this woman, and she was finally asking for something back. But then he mentioned it to Catherine. Catherine's response was immediate and cutting. She said that if he gave money to Eleanor, it would set a precedent. It would make Eleanor dependent. It would undermine her independence. It would be better for Eleanor to figure it out herself. It would build character. Catherine said all of this in a tone that suggested she was being incredibly compassionate and wise. She was helping Eleanor by refusing to help her. That's what she said. James, exhausted from managing a $100 million merger, agreed. It was easier to agree than to fight. It was easier to say nothing than to admit to his wife that he was ashamed of his own mother's poverty. It was easier to let Catherine decide than to admit that he didn't know how to be a good son anymore. James did not give Eleanor the money. Over the next 2 years, the distance grew wider. Catherine began limiting James's contact with his mother. Not directly, just subtly. When Eleanor called, Catherine would say James was in an important meeting. When Eleanor asked to visit, Catherine would remind James of social commitments they had made. A charity gala, a dinner with investors, a weekend in Napa with Catherine's parents. Every time Eleanor reached out, there was a reason why James couldn't see her. When Eleanor came to the house for holidays, Catherine made sure she felt unwelcome. The guest room was not prepared. The conversation was cold. The dinner was rushed. Catherine would check her watch. She would mention early morning commitments. She would take phone calls during dinner. Every visit, Eleanor felt smaller. Every visit, she understood more clearly that she was not wanted, that her son had chosen his wife's comfort over his mother's presence. By the time James was 41, he rarely thought about his mother at all. She had become a guilt he had learned to suppress, a voice he had learned to ignore. Easier to ignore than to address. Easier to pretend she didn't exist than to admit that he had abandoned her. Eleanor, meanwhile, lost her apartment. The landlord gave her 60 days' notice. She moved into a smaller place. That landlord also gave her notice after 8 months. She moved again to a room she rented from a woman who asked too many questions about the rent being late, who mentioned it constantly, who made Eleanor feel like she was stealing just by existing in that space. At 65, Eleanor was working part-time at a coffee shop for minimum wage. At 66, she was working 2 part-time jobs. At 67, she had nowhere left. She never asked James again. Pride maybe, or clarity, or the simple understanding that her son had chosen someone else's version of success over her. Whatever it was, she stopped calling. She stopped expecting. She stopped hoping that things would be different. She ended up at a shelter called Safe Haven on Mission Street. Not because she was an addict or mentally ill or any of the reasons people assume when they think of homelessness. She ended up there because life doesn't always give you warning before it takes everything. Because sometimes you do everything right and it still isn't enough. Because sometimes your own child forgets you. The shelter was run by a woman named Carol who had been working with homeless populations for 30 years. Carol noticed Eleanor on her first night. She noticed that Eleanor didn't sleep well, that she held her belongings close like they might disappear, that she was ashamed. Not ashamed of being homeless, but ashamed of the fact that her son didn't know. Ashamed that she had raised him to be better than this, and he had proven her right, but also proved that better didn't include her. Carol helped Eleanor find a routine. A bed, 3 meals a day, a place to shower. The basics that Eleanor had taken for granted her entire life. Carol also helped Eleanor understand that homelessness wasn't a moral failure. That she wasn't here because she was broken or weak or deserving of punishment. She was here because the world was broken. Because one unexpected illness could destroy a lifetime of work. Because family could disappear without warning. Because sometimes the people you loved chose to forget you. Eleanor got a library card. She spent her days reading in the San Francisco Public Library. She read novels. She read biographies. She read about other people's lives because her own felt too painful to examine closely. She made a friend named David who was also living at the shelter. David had been a teacher. He had lost his job to mental illness and addiction had followed. He was 7 years sober now, but couldn't seem to rebuild. Eleanor and David ate breakfast together every morning. They talked about books. They talked about the things they missed. They talked about the people who had forgotten them. Eleanor had been at the shelter for 14 months when she finally agreed to stand outside and panhandle. Carol had suggested it gently. Eleanor had resisted. She had said that begging felt like admitting defeat, that it felt like proving everyone right who had ever said she would amount to nothing. But money was tight at the shelter. The funding was always tight. And Eleanor wanted to help. She wanted to contribute, even in this small way. So she made a sign. She used a piece of cardboard and a black marker. She wrote, "Anything helps. God bless you." She borrowed a jacket that was warm enough for the San Francisco winter. She had given away her nice blue jacket years ago when she was still hoping that good things would happen to her. But she had other warm clothes now. Donated clothes. Shelter clothes. She stood on the corner of Market and Fifth and held her sign and waited. Some people gave her money. Most people didn't look at her. They walked past with their phones in their hands and their minds somewhere else. Eleanor didn't mind. She understood. She had been the kind of person who walked past people like her too. She had been busy. She had been focused on her son. She had been trying to build a future that would be safe and secure. She had understood then that you had to walk past people like her to get where you needed to go. James was in San Francisco closing a $200 million real estate deal. It was November. Cold. He came out of the building at 6 in the evening, feeling that specific satisfaction that comes from winning something you wanted badly. Closing a deal this large meant everything. He learned that Eleanor had been in his neighborhood many times. She had walked past his office building. She had seen the sign with his name on it. And she had kept walking because she didn't know how to be his mother anymore when she had become so small. James sat in his office on the 42nd floor of a glass building and cried for the first time in 17 years. Not because he was sad, because he was furious. Because he had built an empire and lost the person who made it possible. Because he had been so busy becoming someone that he had forgotten to be someone's son. He called his lawyer. He called his doctor. He called his business partner and said he needed time off. He didn't explain why. Then he went to the shelter. He went to Safe Haven and found Carol in her office. He told her who he was. He told her who his mother was. He asked for permission to see her. Carol's expression changed. It softened and hardened at the same time. She had seen this before. She had seen people come looking for their family members when it was almost too late. She had seen guilt and love and shame all mixed together. She took him to the common room. Eleanor was sitting at a table doing a puzzle with David. They were laughing about something. Eleanor was smiling in a way that James hadn't seen in decades. A real smile. An unguarded smile. The kind of smile that came from genuine connection. When she saw James, the smile disappeared. She just looked at him. She didn't stand up. She didn't run to him. She just looked. And James could see in her eyes that she had been expecting this to happen for a very long time. That she had imagined this moment hundreds of times. And now that it was here, she didn't know what to do with it. James said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Eleanor took his hand and said, "I know you are. But I don't need your apologies. I need you to understand something. I raised you to be strong. I raised you to succeed. I raised you to be better than me. I did that because I wanted you to have a life where you didn't have to choose between your dignity and survival. And somewhere you forgot that the point of being better wasn't to be above anyone. It was to be able to lift them up." James brought his mother home that night. Not to the house he shared with Catherine. To a new apartment he rented immediately. A place that was his. He hired the best doctors to treat her pneumonia. He hired the best therapist to help her process what she had endured. He put money in her name so she would never have to ask anyone for anything ever again. And then he filed for divorce from Catherine. Catherine fought him in court. She had lawyers. She had money. She had the kind of ruthlessness that comes from believing you deserve things you didn't earn. But James had something stronger. He had clarity. And he had receipts. Text messages. Emails. A documented campaign of emotional abuse and isolation that went back years. Catherine had been so confident in her power over James that she had left a trail. Evidence of her deliberate manipulation. Evidence of her cruelty toward Eleanor. Evidence of her systematic isolation of James from his own family. When the divorce was final, it cost James $80 million. Catherine had negotiated hard. But there was a limit to what James would give. $50 million for her. $30 million for legal fees and taxes and the financial restructuring. And that was it. He was done with her. He was done with that life. He didn't regret a single penny. Eleanor recovered slowly. The pneumonia went away. The pneumonia was just a physical illness. The psychological damage took longer to heal. The trauma of being abandoned. The trauma of being homeless. The trauma of standing on a street corner, holding a sign while her son walked past without seeing her. Those things took time. But gradually, with the help of Carol who still came to visit, and with the help of a therapist who specialized in trauma, and most importantly with the help of her son who showed up every single day, Eleanor began to understand that she had been a real mother, that she had done everything right, that her son had gotten lost, but he had found his way back. That love was stronger than ambition after all. 1 year after James brought Eleanor home, they stood together at the groundbreaking for the Eleanor Peterson Foundation, an organization dedicated to housing and support for homeless seniors. There was a crowd. There were journalists. There was a mayor. Eleanor was 89 years old. She was healthy. She was safe. She was seen. James said something at that ceremony that mattered. He said, "I spent 15 years building an empire. I spent those years believing that success meant leaving my past behind. I built it thinking that the higher I climbed, the stronger I became. But strength doesn't come from rising above where you came from. It comes from remembering. It comes from loyalty. It comes from being willing to give up everything you have for the person who gave you everything when you had nothing. The crowd applauded. But Eleanor wasn't listening to the crowd. She was looking at her son, really looking at him. And for the first time in decades, she saw the boy she had raised. The one who was grateful. The one who understood that love wasn't something you could buy back once you sold it. It was something you had to protect every single day. Some people ask if James and Eleanor's relationship went back to exactly what it was. The answer is no. You can't rebuild the past. But they built something new, something stronger, something based on the kind of honesty that only comes when you have lost everything and have to decide if it's worth getting back. James visited his mother every single day for the rest of her life. Eleanor lived to be 96 years old. She saw her son become someone different, someone humble, someone who remembered. When she died, James didn't just mourn her. He changed his will. He donated half his wealth to the foundation. He stepped down from his position as CEO. He spent the second half of his life doing what his mother had taught him, lifting people up, making sure no one had to choose between their dignity and survival, making sure that no one had to stand on a street corner holding a sign while their son walked past. This is a story about what we owe to the people who gave us everything. It's a story about how easy it is to forget, how easy it is to convince yourself that you're too busy, too successful, too far removed from where you started. It's a story about how someone else's voice can poison you if you let it, how the wrong person in your life can make you forget the people who shaped you. And it's also a story about redemption, about the fact that even when you have lost your way so completely that you don't recognize your own mother on the street, you can still find your way back. You can still choose to be better. You can still rebuild what you broke. The question isn't whether James deserves forgiveness. The question is whether you have forgotten anyone like Eleanor in your own life. Whether there's someone who gave you everything when you had nothing, and you stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped remembering. Because this story isn't really about James and Eleanor. It's about all of us. It's about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. It's about whether success is worth the cost of losing the people who made your success possible. It's about whether fitting in is worth sacrificing loyalty. It's about whether we're brave enough to admit when we've been wrong and strong enough to do something about it. Drop another comment and tell us, have you forgotten anyone? Have you let success or pride or the wrong person convince you that loyalty was weakness? Tell us your story. We read every single comment. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the people in your life that you might have neglected, please hit that like button and subscribe, because next week we're telling the story of a woman who discovered that her husband wasn't protecting her. He was collecting her. He was documenting her every move. And what she found when she finally looked at the footage will shock you. It will change how you see relationships. It will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust. You won't want to miss that. I'll see you there.